Welcome to EMBARGOED, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade. I'm one of your hosts, Tim O'Toole, and with me today is my friend, colleague, and co-host Sue Millar of the law firm of Stephenson, Harwood in London. Sue, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here. I can't promise intelligent conversation.
Well, sometimes we promise more than we can deliver, but we'll do our best, I guess. So today, I think we're going to focus just on one topic. We're going to talk about the price caps, but I'll talk about the price caps here in the U.S., and you can talk about the price caps in the U.K. And to get started, I thought I would just kind of give a little rundown on the U.S. side and then turn it over to you to talk about the U.K. side, and then we can have a dialogue. So on the U.S. side, and I'm guessing that these are going to be pretty similar because they were coordinated between the allies, but the U.S. and the G7 allies decided to impose price caps on Russian oil, and they began in December of 2022 with price caps on Russian crude oil that OFAC put into place. And they used a rather unique mechanism to put those caps into place. So basically, what they did, at least on this side of the Atlantic, is that OFAC identified certain services that, if used in connection with Russian oil, would result in would be prohibited unless the price of the crude oil was below a certain amount. And then on December 5th, the Secretary of the Treasury announced the amount at $60 a barrel. So the covered services that the U.S. currently prohibits, if they relate to the maritime transport of Russian crude oil, are trading and commodities brokering. Commodities brokering, that's a hard word to say. Financing, shipping, insurance, and that includes reinsurance, protection, and indemnity, flagging, and customs brokering. So those services are presumptively prohibited in connection with Russian oil. I guess the only other thing to kind of add to this is that basically the prohibition applies as long as the Russian oil is being transported by sea. When it gets to a company or to a country and clears customs, at that point the prohibition goes away unless the items come back out to sea after they clear customs. So whenever Russian oil is at sea, if it hasn't been substantially transformed, the prohibition applies, but it goes away if it clears customs and then there's land transport, or if it's substantially transformed. So that's the prohibition on Russian crude oil that OFAC put into place, or maritime services in connection with it, on December 5th. Coming on February 5th, there will be a new prohibition on Russian petroleum products, similar, almost identical terms to the prohibition, and both of these prohibitions had what is in essence a wind down provision. So if the oil had shipped, or the crude oil had shipped by December 5th, there was a prohibition, or that there was a wind down provision that allowed for an exemption to these prohibitions that continued until January 19th. So it just ended earlier, less than a week ago. And then in connection with the new prohibition coming February 5th that relates to services provided in connection with Russian petroleum products, which is broader than the crude oil, that has a wind down prohibition that ends in mid-March. So those are the basic rules of the U.S. side. And so now I will kind of pass it over to you, Sue, to talk about some of the differences or maybe the similarities with the prohibition on the UK side.
Yeah, I think the basic reality is that all three regimes, the UK, EU, and US regimes, are pretty much aligned. The only real difference is that the UK regime contains additional reporting obligations. And those reporting obligations are many and varied depending on the tier of the particular economic operator, because, as you know, Tim, there are tier 1, 2, and 3 operators, and they have different obligations. What I think is very interesting is that, first of all, I think it's really important to appreciate that the purpose of the oil price cap and the general license is not to permit the importation of trade of oil or oil products into the UK, the US, the EU, but it is to facilitate trade between Russia and third countries, because the real issue, the political issue, was that the G7 didn't want to be accused of basically preventing other third countries from having energy security. So I think that's one of the reasons that they came up with the cap. Um, and the other thing that I think is immediately interesting is that OFSI, which is the Office for Financial Sanctions Implementation, has been given the role to enforce the oil price cap and the reporting obligations. You and I have talked about this before, Tim. Um, I don't think OFSI has the statutory authority to actually enforce trade sanctions. It's very clear from Hansard that, but that's the publication which records all of the parliamentary debates. It's very clear from Hansard that it was not the intention of the government at the time that OFSI was established for it to implement or enforce anything other than financial sanctions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's something that we've talked about that is quite interesting. I mean, I don't think there's any real question on the U.S. side that OFAC does have the authority to implement trade sanctions, although it really started out as a financial regulator. OFAC has been imposing penalties in the trade realm now in connection with sanctions programs for a number of years, and has pretty much built up a body of work that suggests that that's allowed. But from the UK side, do you expect challenges in terms of OFSI's authority to implement the price caps?
Well, I mean, it's very early days, but I suspect that if we get to a point at which an economic operator is subject to an enforcement action, that's going to be one of the points that they will want to take.
Right. And I guess that, one of the things that in kind of giving the background that I didn't spend much time on, but I think you brought it up a little bit, Sue, and that is the record keeping provision. And I'm assuming that this is similar to the UK, but the US has what they've called a safe harbor provision. So if you are, providing these sorts of services and someone comes to you and tries to start an enforcement action, there are protections, and they divide them into tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, depending upon the level of services you're providing. If you're tier 1, you're dealing directly with the oil and you should be able to prove that you bought the oil at a particular price. The later service providers who are not dealing directly with the oil itself have in some ways lesser obligations, but they need to essentially get certifications along the way that the oil has met the cap. Are those basically the same in the UK?
Yeah, they are. They're basically the same. I think there are differing obligations in terms of the length of time that the records have to be kept. In the UK, it's 4 years from the end of the year in which the activity took place.
Yeah, I think in the U.S. it's 5 years, which is actually the standard OFAC record keeping provision. Generally lasts 5 years, and does it operate the same way in terms of this is kind of a safe harbor provision? So if you comply in good faith, even if it turns out that you are wrong, that the oil actually was over the price cap, if you can show that you did this diligence, essentially you have a full defense as long as you relied in good faith on the records.
I don't think that's necessarily the same here in the UK, in the sense that OFSI has been given the authority to impose civil penalties on a strict liability basis. So there's OFSI does not need to show any reasonable cause to suspect. It's a straightforward, you breached.
Interesting. I mean, so in the OFAC guidance, they actually specifically mentioned that what this safe harbor process is designed to do is shield anyone from the strict liability that would usually apply. But basically, what you have to do is you have to show that you inadvertently dealt in the the price of in Russian oil that was above the cap price, and showed that you were essentially lied to by somebody along the way, and that you didn't know or have reason to know that those statements that were made to you about the price were incorrect or false.
I think it's certainly, I think certainly it would operate as mitigation, or at least it might go further than mitigation, in the sense that obviously might choose not to enforce at all in circumstances where they were satisfied that economic operators, whether they be tier 1, tier 2 or tier 3, had behaved appropriately.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that seems to be the purpose of these, but again, the proof is going to be in the pudding, because on the one hand, if you have these certifications, it seems like the message, or at least the implicit message, is you should be fine. On the other hand, my guess is that there will always be facts from which, especially in hindsight, maybe you could have known that the certifications were wrong, and so
Yeah,
that seems to negate the good faith, the safe harbor provision.
and that's one of the warnings that's actually given in the guidance in the guidance in the UK, which is basically you can collate all of the material that you need to collate, but you need to do appropriate due diligence in order to satisfy yourself that you can rely on those what they're called attestations in the UK parlance.
Now, how about, so I guess it's still early, because oil takes a long time to transport quite often, and the first, at least in the U.S. side, the first wind down, or say the first, it, the first window for enforcement really didn't start till January 19th, because if the oil had shipped by December 5th, then it just had to arrive at its final destination by January 19th, for the price caps not to apply. So that for now they apply to everything. I mean, even if it was shipped before December 5th, if the oil hasn't arrived yet, the price caps at least theoretically apply. I haven't really had many questions come up on this yet. I'm wondering if you've heard anything from your clients about compliance burdens, or people checking their forms, or anything like that.
No, it's been pretty quiet so far.
Yeah, I'm actually a little surprised. I mean, a year ago, when these sanctions went into place, I mean, I assume it was similar for you. I mean, I couldn't catch my breath, and this year, the price caps went into place, and I know we both have clients who are at least in industries that touch on the price caps. I really haven't heard much of anything.
No, it's been pretty it's kind of almost eerily quiet.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess part of it is that we're talking about, by definition, because both the UK and the US have the oil import bans, oil that is going somewhere else besides, the US or UK. But I would still think, the companies that are in the insurance industry and the oil trading industry, that they would start to have questions about the price caps. And I haven't heard a thing.
I suspect they're still finding their feet, because it's very
Yeah.
new legislation, isn't it, on both
Yeah.
sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah, and it may also be true that a lot of companies got out of the Russian market, because I did have a lot of clients who completely divested, and so they may have just not been trading in Russian oil, even though they could have.
And for the tier 1 operators, they may not have made their reports yet, because they've got
Right.
they've got 40 days to do so, and they can compile multiple entry reports and file them every 30 days.
Yeah. So I guess we're at the very beginning of this. I guess the other question that I have kind of is, we've got the broader, in some ways, prohibition coming that applies to petroleum products. At least in the U.S., that comes into place, I think, on February 5th. Is it the same in the UK?
Yeah, it's the same in the UK. So we'll have things like diesel and all of the other good stuff.
Interesting. So I guess and I'm not hearing anything on those yet either. But if we don't have clients who are even in the crude oil shipping business or the maritime services business related to that asking questions even after the prohibition comes into place. I guess it's not that surprising that we're not hearing much from companies where the prohibition hasn't even started.
Yeah, just returning to the scope of the maritime services. One thing that I think is interesting, which has come out of the EU guidance, is confirmation that classification services are excluded from the definition of maritime services.
Interesting. Um, and is there in both the well, certainly the UK and the EU, did they have a definition of crude oil that fits the harmonized tariff schedule, or did they use a different one?
Um, I think we may use slightly different codes than you use.
Got it.
It's either HS or CN, but I think
Okay.
I can't off the top of my head, I can't remember what the code was.
Okay. I'm just wondering if they, because it seems like it has been so coordinated. I'm wondering if they even coordinated the tariff codes, but it sounds like they probably didn't. So I guess from here, the next thing that we would potentially see is has OFSI provided any um, confirmation that it believes that it has the authority to issue these price caps? Has it responded to any of the critiques about whether or not it can engage in trade regulation as opposed to financial services regulation?
It has been remarkably silent. As you know, Steve and I at Stephenson Harwood have been quite exercised by this for a little while, and there has been nothing coming out of OFSI, officially or otherwise, as to what their position is. So one can
It's
only assume that they think they've got it.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess from maybe from their perspective, I think if it were OFAC, what OFAC would say to an argument like this is, well, we're just regulating services, and so there's financing services that's within our realm, and there's insurance, and that's within our realm. But the problem, as I see it, I mean, it also regulates brokering. Um, Customs brokering, and it regulates ship flagging. I mean, it is a lot broader than just financial services.
And
So,
I think the other issue is, the regulation, the Russia regulation, is split between financial sanctions and trade sanctions. And, you know, again, another thing which I think is interesting and query whether it's overreach in respect of OFSI is in respect of the trust sanctions. OFSI has been given the powers to enforce them as well.
and who under the UK law, the Russian sanctions law that OFSI is operating under, who has the power to enforce trade sanctions?
Generally speaking, it would be investigated by the ECJU or BEIS, BEIS. That's the export control joint unit, and then who would refer their cases for prosecution to HMRC or to other prosecuting authorities, potentially the NCA.
Interesting. I mean, that sounds a little bit like our system is set up. So OFAC, it at least starts from the Treasury, and usually, at least its history was that it focused on trade sanctions, and then we have the Commerce Department that really focuses on export controls. But in a lot of the sanctions programs, OFAC has kind of taken over the field, but it shares jurisdiction sometimes with BIS. But the trade caps, even though they touch on some areas where I mean, honestly, when you read the prohibition in the directive or the determination that was put out by the Treasury Department, it is phrased in terms of exportation, re-exportation, sale or supply, directly or indirectly from the United States, and then by a United States person of covered services. So, to the extent we're talking about exports, you'd think that potentially commerce could have a role, but here it's all been the Treasury.
Yeah, I think the UK enforcement agencies are in something of disarray. Um, it's clear that OFSI is overrun. They are recruiting significantly. They're looking to double their workforce within this year. But the ECJU are in similar disarray, it seems to me. I think they're very used to dealing with export control licenses, and they're not familiar at all with the trade sanctions. Just to give you an example, we received a letter in respect of a license application that we had made in May 2022 for something which was very clearly trade sanctions related. And our client received a response within the last couple of weeks or so. And the statement from the ECJU was, "Have you not spoken with OFSI?"
So it took them 9 months to tell you to go talk to somebody else?
Yeah, and OFSI just simply don't have the authority to issue licenses for trade sanctions.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's a good example of how, one of the things that has come out of the Russian sanctions, I think more on the UK and the EU side than on the US side, is kind of for the first time, these sanctions authorities are starting to flex their muscles and issue new regulations and start to talk about enforcement, and people seem to be taking it very seriously, but there's always some growing pains. I've seen it a lot in the EU, and it sounds like the UK is certainly going through those as well.
Yeah. I mean, at least in the UK, we have penalties in place. And in the EU, basically the Commission had to put out a directive effectively to require member states to have effective penalties for sanctions breaches.
Wow. Well, so I guess on the price caps, anything else to add? I mean, I think right now we're kind of waiting for the questions to come in and waiting for the newest petroleum products cap to go into place. But on the U.S. side of the pond, I think we are in a wait and see mode. I think there was a lot of talk beforehand about the price caps, but so far quiet on this front.
It might be worthwhile just saying a few words about the exceptions.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about the exceptions.
So one of the exceptions is oil products which merely transit Russia. So specifically, I guess, the oil originating from Kazakhstan, that's not subject to the price cap.
And in fact, it's interesting. So we at least, I know OFAC had some guidance on this in connection with the import ban relating to Russian origin oil, that there was some guidance in connection with that prohibition back in, I think, March or April, that said the same thing in connection with the import ban, that they were not counting Kazakhstan oil that transported Russia as Russian oil. It had to be Russian origin oil. So it sounds like the price caps are operating in the same way, that it's basically only oil that actually comes from Russia and not just transiting.
Yeah. And the other thing is obviously tank healing. Residue left in tanks is not covered by the price cap, but it does apply to commingling.
Yeah, I think that's very important. I mean, because I have actually, not in connection with the price caps, but have had questions before about commingling, because it's apparently in these tankers, it's very hard to get the tanks completely clean, and so there's almost always some form of commingling if you've got a tanker that's ever carried the sort of oil that you don't want to have anything to do with. And so it's good that they provided that guidance, because I've had questions come up with it in connection with other oil sanctions programs, let's just say.
And then just in relation to the reporting obligations, they are quite complicated, but a tier 1 entity must report to OFSI within 40 days of each transaction. Where there are multiple reports, these can be consolidated. I think I mentioned that earlier. Tier 2 and Tier 3 entities transacting directly with a Tier 1 entity must request and obtain confirmation that the Tier 1 entity has reported its activities to OFSI as required, and that's quarterly for Tier 2 entities and periodically for Tier 3 entities. And I guess what's significant here is that lots of the Tier 3 entities are likely to be insurers. So, the reporting obligations will be in line with policy and periods ending, and again, the attestation requirements can be satisfied by policy wording, which I think is quite interesting and at least helpful to the Tier 3 entities.
Yeah, that is the most helpful. I mean, I will say it sounds like the UK burdens are significantly more than the US. I mean, the US is, get the attestations and maintain records, or you've got a big problem if there's an enforcement action. But it's not a reporting requirement per se. It's just a protection and record keeping requirement.
Yeah, there's a positive reporting obligation here in the UK, and the rules say that where the relevant Tier 2, Tier 3 entity doesn't receive the attestation or other confirmation from a Tier 1 entity, they're required to inform OFSI of that fact and then withdraw their services as soon as reasonably practical. There's some guidance around what is reasonably practicable, because if a vessel is at sea, there might be significant difficulties in basically withdrawing insurance cover during the period whilst it's at sea. And then if you're dealing with a non-UK Tier 1 entity, Tier 2 entities have to inform OFSI of this fact every quarter, and Tier 3 entities again annually, periodically, depending on what their particular obligations are.
And based on those reporting obligations, I suspect that you'll start to see enforcement actions sooner in the UK than you will in the US. I mean, because in the US, the fact that somebody hasn't reported anything is not in and of itself going to be a problem. And I think that, with the affirmative reporting obligations, and particularly the one that you just mentioned, Sue, which is the obligation to let them know if something has gone wrong, if you're kind of one of the Tier 2 or three persons in the chain or companies in the chain, that is much more likely to start producing reports of violations sooner rather than later than on the U.S. side.
That may be right, but I think it depends upon whether
OFSI
has the manpower to actually review the the reports and identify gaps.
No, I think that's and that that it can be a challenge on the OFAC side too. I know that the U.S. Enforcement authorities are devoting considerable resources to enforcing the Russian sanctions generally. Whether or not they're gonna, I haven't seen any evidence that they're going to be focused on compliance with the price caps. But again, I think it's too soon to tell whether or not that's going to be the case. But and then whether they have the extra resources to do this, because it would be pretty demanding from the U.S. side. You'd actually have to figure out who's providing these sorts of services by definition, kind of outside the U.S. and mostly outside the EU. Although I will say you talked about some of the exceptions. There's some pretty specific general licenses in the U.S. that apply to some of the EU countries, Bulgaria, Croatian, and landlocked EU member states. Apparently, that's to line up with some of the EU regulations on that. And then there's also a general license that allows for certain maritime transport from Sakhalin II, as long as it's for import into Japan. So there's some little carve outs for some of the allied countries for specific transactions. But for the most part, you're probably talking about transactions that are taking place outside the EU, outside the US, outside the UK, and those are at least traditionally a lot harder to enforce, since our countries don't have law enforcement agents that are necessarily stationed in those countries with law enforcement, while they have law enforcement authority to investigate some of these issues.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I suppose we should actually just comment on what the Russia's attitude is in Russia's response to the oil price caps, which is to say we will not trade with any entity which enforces the oil price cap.
Which is fun, which is in some ways interesting. I mean, so I guess the price caps won't work if nobody who's using them is buying Russian oil, and it seems kind of like you have a standoff situation. Maybe that's why we're not hearing anything. The Russians won't sell to anybody who enforces the price caps, and the service providers can't provide any services to companies that aren't complying with the price caps. So maybe there's just like not a lot of Russian oil sales, but I haven't heard about that at all either. So I would suspect that something else is going on.
Yeah, that would
There
be
certainly
my
can't be
instinct.
full compliance with Russian law and full compliance with UK and US law at the same time. Something is going to have to give. Well, great. And then I guess the final kind of piece to this puzzle is there is a general license, at least here in the US, for emergency services that might otherwise violate these services prohibitions. Haven't seen that come up yet, but
yeah, it's the same in the UK.
Great. All right. Well, anything else about the price caps before we go on to our day jobs?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the detail is in the licenses, and so it certainly repays careful reading.
Yeah, definitely. If you have a situation that you think might come within an exception to the price cap, it's certainly worth reading. And if you're a company out there listening and you haven't and you're in any of these businesses and you're doing providing services, maritime services in the oil trade, if you haven't set up your compliance program, you really need to start, because it is quite complex to comply with these regulations, in my view.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I just wonder whether it's worth saying a final word about the tiers.
Sure.
So tier 1 is commodity brokers, traders. Tier 2 is people in the middle, intermediaries.
Right.
So tier 1 is entities that can be expected to know the prevailing market price, and therefore
right. They're buying it.
Yeah.
From the original seller.
Yeah. Tier 2 are intermediaries, so they might be financial institutions who are financing specific transactions. And in the UK, at least, a distinction is made between financial institutions who are financing specific trade and financial institutions who are financing general trade. The first category would be tier 2, and the second category would be tier 3. And the tier 2 are those entities who might have some information about the market price of oil and the price and what's being purchased. And then tier 3 is the entities that are relying on information from tier 1, tier 2.
Right. So you've got the ship owners and the carriers and the insurers who are far enough out of the loop that they're not going to be expected to know directly what the price is, but they'll have to rely on tier 1 and tier 2.
Yeah, and no doubt individual operators would need to get their own advice as to which category they fall into, because I can foresee entities falling between the cracks.
And are the obligations different depending upon the tier? Because in the States, if you're tier 1, you've got to actually get and retain the actual price information. If you're tier 2, the guidance is a little bit mushy. It basically says that you have to request and retain the price information to the extent practicable, but if you can't get it from the tier 1 customer counterparty, then you can get an attestation. So, and then tier 3 just needs to get an attestation from somebody in the chain, either tier 1 or tier 2.
Yeah, but at each stage, there's a lot of focus in the guidance on due diligence and being able to satisfy yourself that you can rely on the attestation or the information that's been provided.
Yeah, and OFAC does a little bit of that. So OFAC talks about compliance measures. So for tier one companies, they should be updating the terms of their contracts and updating the invoice structure to make sure that there's an itemized oil price. With respect to tier two, they're really supposed to do the training to try and make sure that their people understand that there is this price cap in place, and that they're essentially the oil buyers are aware of this. So they're essentially trying to use questionnaires for the companies that they are essentially providing the services for, and then putting sanctions compliance clauses into their contracts. And I think that's really the main tier three diligence beyond the attestation form, is that they also have to have sanctions compliances and have guidance to make sure that their staff is aware of this issue.
Yeah, it's pretty similar here. What is different is that, slightly different at least, is that the US and the EU's guidance in terms refer to the need that you've just referred to, the potential need that you've just referred to, which is to have itemized invoices, which actually separate out the various costs that are being incurred, the costs of transportation, insurance, in addition to the actual oil price. And the UK doesn't, but it does refer to the need to be careful and scrutinize invoices to ensure that the oil price cap isn't being manipulated in order to make it look. Invoices aren't being manipulated in order to make it look like there's compliance with the cap when there isn't. And actually, the other thing that's quite helpful from the guidance is that the UK guidance gives examples of potential manipulations that you have to look out for.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, part of the reason I wanted to have this discussion is because this sanctions regime is so different than anything that I remember seeing before, because usually you either have a prohibition or you have a general license that allows certain things, and they don't kind of work hand in glove, where they say you can't do X unless the price of the commodity it falls within a certain range. And so it's a novel sanctions technique combined with what I view as a far higher compliance burden than any other sanctions provision that I've seen. I mean, it's much easier to tell somebody no or to say yes, but it's so much harder to say yes, but only if the following conditions apply, and then count on people in the sales force and in the business practice to make sure on the ground that those conditions are applying. So I'm curious to see how well this plays out. And what prompted me to say that was your discussion about the invoicing. I mean, what the sanctions authorities are essentially expecting is that their sanctions are going to change the entirety of the commercial invoicing practices in this area, because I don't think price per gallon was necessarily factored into itemized invoices as a general matter, and this assumes that it will have to be in order to comply with these sanctions. Yeah. All right. Well, Brave New World. I think it sounds like the consensus is too soon to tell whether or not it's having any effect or what the effect is. But I expect we'll hear soon enough from the enforcement authorities what they think the effect is.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be interesting. Watch this space.
Yes, watch this space. Maybe watch this space to see a challenge to Off-Seas Authority at some point in the near future. All right. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, Sue. It's great talking to you.
Thanks very much, Tim. Take care.
Produced by Heartcast Media.